All right, for your Harriet Tubman essay, I've set up a few discussion boards to kind of get you thinking about how you could use some of those documents. There's a film clip that I show about Harriet Jacobs. Now, remember, Harriet Jacobs is not Harriet Tubman. Sometimes students confuse those two because they both have the same first name. But I really like this film clip because it really contextualizes enslavement, particularly from the perspective of a woman in the 19th century. And Jacob's story is also just a really incredible story. So I outlined that film for you. You've got the outline in the module. If you want to follow the outline while you watch over the film, it's about 20 or so minutes. And then it ends, makes this really good point about how slavery demanded a different type of motherhood, which I think is a different type of womanhood in the 19th century, which is kind of essentially what you're thinking about, is how Tubman goes against the traditional gender notions of the time. So again, what you'd probably want to do is start with chapter 4 and Through Women's Eyes, because chapter 4 sets up what the ideal was, the call of domesticity. You could use the images from Godey's as evidence of what that call of domesticity looked like. I gave you a discussion board where we can talk about that if you'd like some more assistance there. And then I broke up the documents according to how you did it in the extra credit, and I gave you some kind of key things to think about with some of the more significant documents. But just as an overview, to kind of think about ways that she goes against traditional notions of the time. The text, the film, and then the biography notes that Harriet Tubman runs away when most people don't run away, and particularly most women don't run away. She runs away. She goes without her brothers. And then what about her husband, right? You have that really fabulous document where she responds to him when she finds out that he's remarried. So not only does she go against him, kind of defying ideas of gender at the time, but then when she learns about his remarriage, her response is pretty fantastic. She breaks federal law on multiple occasions to do this. She is a leader of men. The documents note that she carries a gun. She has a network which includes men, and then she speaks in public, and she raises money. She's the supporter of her family. These men that are in her network praise her. We've got a couple of documents where you can see that. The Combahee River Raid is another example of her leadership, and speaks to the ways in which she was different during the Civil War from like traditional gender notions. She's also given the names of men as a leader. She's called Moses. She's called General. In terms of her family, she marries a younger man. Well, she basically leaves her first husband, and she marries a man that's half her age. She has children later in life, and then she ultimately, again, is the breadwinner of her family and has to fight for a pension to get access to those funds. So again, that's just kind of a overview of the ways that she goes against those gender norms, and then what you want to do is kind of find evidence in the documents to support those points. And again, in the discussion boards, I kind of led you with thinking about some of those documents. Two things I want to point out to you in the introduction. First, on page, where is it? Page 8. Sometimes students, when they read page 8, they note that one of the things that made Tubman different is, Horton says here that as girls grew into adolescence, they were also subject to sexual harassment and rape by their masters or other male family members. Angry mistresses were likely to harshly punish slave women who received too much attention from their masters, which mistresses took as a sign of their spouse's sexual interest in them. Fortunately for Harriet, she was not a victim of such sexual violence. By the time she was 12, her independent spirit made her owner consider her too quick-tempered and undisciplined for domestic labor, and he sent her to work in the fields. So sometimes students use that as a an indication of the way in which Harriet went against conventional norms. A handful of things about that. First, all slaves, like 95 to 98% of them, worked in the fields. So Tubman working in the fields, there's nothing unusual about that. Second, we can't know that Harriet Tubman was not sexually assaulted or that she was raped. Jacobs, who you're going to watch that film clip about, she writes about it, but even she writes about it in really cloaked terms. Women today don't acknowledge sexual assault or rape. So a woman of the 19th century is not going to write about it. So we just can't know that that didn't happen, when in all likelihood it happened to many women who were enslaved. And then also when she says her independent spirit and her quick temper, this makes it sound like women who were attacked by their owners just didn't have that independent spirit or that quick temper to prevent it, which blames the victim. So I would encourage you just to not include that section from chapter 8. It's got some problems. And then another thing to point out too, and I put this in one of the discussion boards, is family, because Harriet Tubman mentions that at one point that she didn't have children, but you've got some pages in the biography that dispute that. You've got page 57. Historians actually think that Tubman, what might have prompted her escape may have been the fact that she was pregnant. On page 57, you have the story of Margaret, and some historians believe that Margaret may have actually been Tubman's biological child. And then she adopts a child later in life. That's on page 80. And then she adopts another child 10 years later in her early 60s. That's on page 81. So look at those pages in the biography, because they'll help you kind of challenge your ideas of family. All right. So be sure and send me emails if you've got questions. And I really encourage you to use those discussion boards, because if you've got the question, I know somebody else does too. And if we can kind of have those conversations, and that if you're comfortable with it, if we can have those conversations on those more public discussion boards, it will assist other students who are kind of wondering some of the same things. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye.